The first part of this lecture talked about the causes for why Europeans were exploring new lands and gives us the reason as to why Columbus eventually sails west across the Atlantic Ocean and ends up in a new continent that they didn't know about, North America, specifically the Bahamas, and at a point in South America. But they didn't even know it existed at the time. And so we learned about the reasons that Europeans did that, and there was number one, they were looking for a new sea trade route to India and Asia. They were trying to convert more people to Christianity, spread their religion. And the last one was to establish new colonies to find those resources that we talked about: gold, spices, metals, all these things that they wanted, were highly sought after. They're trying to find new places to get those resources from, specifically gold and silver, to take back to their home country. So today we're going to start off with the first Americans. Who was here before Europeans? So the first Americans came into what is North America 20,000 to 30,000 years ago. That's a long time. And they came across a land bridge there on the map that you see from Asia across into Alaska down into North America. Before the time, there had been a big glacier blocking the way, but then it melted and there was a gap that allowed people to come south. And by the time it was around 10,000 BC, Native Americans had completely spread across the North American continent. And you can see here in this chart all of the different culture groups that existed. This isn't even the complete list. There were hundreds of them in all different areas of North America, and even down into South America with like the Aztec and the Inca. But they had different cultures, different languages, different societies, and they all lived tens of thousands of years ago before Europeans even discovered this land. And again, like we talked about with the tribes in Kansas, depending on where they lived, they had different cultures. We worked on the Native American tribes in the plains, and we learned about how the geography impacted them. But the living conditions of the Native Americans in America depended on where they lived. You see the igloo up top in the Arctic. You see the teepees. We talked about the teepees and the Plains Indians who were nomadic and followed the tribes. It just depended on where they lived. So Europeans are going to come across a wide variety of Native Americans. They're not just one type of Native American. So here we go. We're starting with Spanish exploration. They're some of the first European group to really spend most of the time first arriving in the New World. So you learned about the Vikings who supposedly came to the Americas before the Spanish. And no one knew if Christopher Columbus knew that or not, but he has come up with the idea that he can sail west across the Atlantic Ocean and reach Asia as a shorter distance than going around the tip of Africa that we talked about. Columbus believed that he could sail across the Atlantic Ocean and find a shorter route, a quicker route to Asia and India than going around the tip of Africa. And at first he tried to go to Portugal, but they refused to finance his trip, and so he goes to Spain, and the Queen and King of Spain decide to fund his trip. And so they send him off with his 3 ships. You've heard it before: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, and on October 12th, he does land in the Caribbean, right off of the North American continent. So he's not the first person to discover the Americas. There are people there before him. Supposedly the Vikings were there before him, and actually there's now a hypothesis that even some African cultures reached the Americas before Europeans. It's not proven yet, but he is the first to set in motion a chain of events of further and greater European settlement. So this kind of shows his routes he took. He took 4 trips to the Caribbeans. He never really came up to North America itself. He spent his time in Cuba and Hispaniola and in parts of South America, Puerto Rico area. And the maps show exactly where he went. So Spain is going to be the first to really dominate expansion into the New World. So by the 1500s, the Spanish had already a firm hold on the Americas, especially in the south part, which would be mostly present-day Mexico, Florida, and the Caribbean islands. And the main goal of the Spanish was to purely gain more gold and more land. And they sent out people, specifically known as conquistadors, who were soldier adventurers sent to get land and gold, sent to get the land and gold. People like Cortez, Pizarro, Coronado, who will actually be the first European to set foot in Kansas. He travels that far up from Mexico all the way to Kansas. They're there to find the gold and land. And so I'm going to mention two of them. One of them, a conquistador by the name of Hernando Cortez, he actually sails off to the New World, and he ends up in Mexico with 500 soldiers. With 500 soldiers, he is able to capture the capital, Tenochtitlan, of the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire was a massive empire in North America, and they captured it with 500 people, even though the Spanish were outnumbered. And he massacres many of the people in Mexico. And so we'll get to how he's able to accomplish that, but he's there to conquer. Conquistadors are there to conquer, to pillage, and take the valuable goods that are there for the Spanish crown. Another explorer by the name of Francisco Pizarro, he goes down into South America, and he is going to do the same thing that Pizarro did, and he's going to defeat the Incan Empire. And he captures their leader Atahualpa, and kills him, and kills many of the Incan themselves. Even though, once again, the Spanish were highly outnumbered. They come in, march in, conquer the people, and take any resources they can get a hold of, and claim the land for themselves, and expand their empire, bring glory to their empire and to themselves. And so the question is, how did these Spanish conquistadors, who were far outnumbered, I mean by the tens of thousands, far outnumbered by the Native Americans, how are they able to defeat them so easily? Well, it really comes down to geography, in that the places where the Europeans existed, they had access to better resources that allowed them to create advanced technology, such as steel swords, muskets, armor. They had access to horses. Native Americans had never seen horses before Europeans arrived. And a horse is a powerful war animal that can be used as cavalry and is highly effective against people on foot. The most important one, though, was disease. And this image to the right shows actually one of the first images of the impact of smallpox on Native Americans. They died by the millions from diseases that Europeans had because they had no immunity to them. Next is the French. The French will play a big role in exploring the New World, but unlike the Spanish, they are way up north, and actually mostly what is present-day Canada. So they explore along the St. Lawrence River, which comes in right here by Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and comes down into the Great Lakes. So that's where they're spending most of their time, and they established the colony of New France. And to show you this map, the purple region is the French, and again, like I said, they're mostly up in Canada. They are down the Great Lakes region, and they do come down the Mississippi River, but they spend most of their time up north in present-day Canada. There's a reason why French is a commonly spoken language in Canada. And the French are also different from the Spanish in that their goal in the New World was different. They wanted fish and furs, and they wanted to actively trade peacefully with Native Americans for these animal skins to be sold back in Europe. So they kind of wanted to have a mutual relationship, a positive relationship with them. But that doesn't really work out. Even though the French's intentions were pretty good, there were some negative impacts on the Native Americans for taking part in this fur trade. So the first one was that European diseases, well, again, just like the Spanish, Native Americans caught them. They had no immunity to them, and many of them will die. Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands. Also, when the French and the Dutch came here, the demand for these fur pelts was so high that tribes would actually go to war with each other for rights to land to hunt these animals to get the skins for the French and the Dutch. And they killed each other for tribes that for the furs that Europeans wanted. And finally, because the Native Americans were so willing to go trap these animals, and the French themselves were trapping the animals, it caused a decrease in the animal population that Native Americans depended on for food. And so some Native Americans starved, and the food chain was severely damaged and hurt the ecosystem itself. But the food supply was shortened, and as the fur industry ran out, French Europeans weren't as willing to just trade peacefully with Native Americans, and they became more interested in taking over the land that Native Americans were on. Now, the big impact, one of the big effects of Europeans coming over into the New World was the establishment of what has become known as the Columbian Exchange. It was a transfer of people, products, and ideas between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. And you see here, this shows all the products that came from the two sides. These are the things coming from Europe and Asia and Africa, and these are the things coming from the Americas. And they're very different. So there are both positive and negative impacts of the Columbian Exchange. Some of the positive impacts were both sides gained new foods and animals to add to their diet, which really improved the living conditions of both people in that aspect. Especially Europeans brought new animals such as the horses to the Western Hemisphere that were very helpful to the native people, especially the Plains Native Americans who will adopt the horses. And Americans, North America, the Native Americans introduced foods and animals to the rest of the world, which now, today, play a very important part in the food supply. And of course, just like anything, there were negative effects of this. Europeans would take advantage of Native Americans in the new places that they were colonizing. And as I've mentioned several times already, probably the biggest impact on Native Americans was that Europeans brought with them diseases that they just could not fight off. And the reason why Europeans had these diseases that Native Americans didn't were actually from the animals that Europeans had access to that Native Americans didn't. Most diseases we have today actually originate in animals, and Native Americans didn't have access to those diseases from those work animals such as horses, cows, pigs, and so they never had to fight off those diseases, and they weren't ready for it. And so they died by the thousands, millions in some accounts.